The Specter of Communism in Hawaii, 1947 to 1953. Part 2, The Specter Continues. Chapter 9, The 1949 Longshore Strike. 2 days after the closing arguments had been heard in the Rieneki case, a young soil chemist from the University of Hawaii publicly announced that he had resigned his position at the university to become the full-time chairman of the Communist Party in Hawaii. The young man's name was Charles Fujimoto, and in his letter of resignation, which was addressed to Dr. G. Donald Sherman, his department chairman, Fujimoto said, "I resigned as a research chemist at the University of Hawaii to become a full-time official of the Communist Party of Hawaii. By this action, I can make my greatest contribution to the general welfare of the people of Hawaii. The Communist Party of the United States is contributing immensely toward the welfare of the American people and the peoples of the world. It is courageously and consistently fighting against the drive of the monopolists toward fascism and a third world war." Fujimoto went on to discuss some of the repressive measures being taken against communists and suspected communists in the United States. Then he brought the issue home. In Hawaii, the same policy is being followed. The governor has caused to be removed 2 school teachers after 20 years of faithful service. This is only the beginning of a campaign to remove progressives from government jobs. The drive against the labor movement by the Big Five is becoming increasingly bold and violent. The civil liberties of the people are being threatened. My resignation does not mean that the right of any communist to a position in any capacity has been relinquished. I am resigning because my new responsibilities will require my full time. Charles Fujimoto's public announcement produced no stampede of individuals wishing to become open communists. He was, and he continued to be, Hawaii's only open communist. The reaction of the anti-communist press was restrained, and Fujimoto was treated as a pathetic, rather than a sinister, figure. The Star Bulletin was the first to comment editorially to Fujimoto's announcement. By the Constitution of the United States and in the lack of statutes to the contrary, the Communist Party is not illegal. Fujimoto is perfectly at liberty to join it and to promote it. Likewise, he is presumably at liberty to give details about the Communist Party in Hawaii. We can conceive no reason for this apparently candid young man to be so reticent about his party here except that to give details would reveal its paucity in numbers and its lack of substantiality. The advertiser's response was more personal and sought to get at Fujimoto through his family, a very strategic target in the family-oriented Japanese-American community in Hawaii. The editorial was titled Pathetic Young Man. It read, "There is no more pathetic figure in Hawaii today than Charles K. Fujimoto, who has traded his Americanism for Moscow totalitarianism. His father traded the lot of a Japanese peasant for that of a workman in Hawaii, where his children were given the world's best educational opportunities. Now, one of the children chooses a totalitarian oppression worse than that from which his father fled, in preference to the American system that made his success possible, to which he owes all that he has. Russians who flee their native land say conditions there are too horrible for belief. Perhaps Charles should go and see. Goodbye, Charles." The timing of Fujimoto's resignation was probably due as much to expediency as to idealism. It was clear that the Rienekis were going to be dismissed, and it was not difficult for Fujimoto to assume that he would be the territory's next target. Like John Rieneki, he had been closely identified with the Communist Party in the Izuka pamphlet. Additionally, his wife, Eileen, had also been identified as a party member, and to complicate the matter even more was Jack Hall's secretary at the ILWU. There was a poignant quality to Fujimoto's resignation. The advertiser, in a second editorial about Charles Fujimoto, quoted educators in a position to know as having indicated that Fujimoto could have been one of the 2 or 3 outstanding soil technologists in the entire nation. But that was not to be. Fujimoto never again returned to the career in which he was once considered so promising. The public attention given to the Fujimoto announcement was meager and it died down quickly. Talk about communism became less frequent. There were no issues such as the Rieneki case to attract interest, and there were no political campaigns going on. The specter of communism did not rear its head again until the advent of the 1949 Longshore Strike. With this strike, the most devastating in Hawaii's history, communism once again became a flaming issue in the territory. As the strike deadline of April 10, 1949, drew near, it looked very much like a classical labor dispute. The ILWU was seeking a 32-cent wage hike while the stevedoring companies were offering 8 cents. The ILWU had declared its willingness to submit the matter to arbitration while the employers rejected that as a means of settlement, which put employees and outsiders in control of private business. The ILWU argued for parity with West Coast dock workers while bosses argued that dissimilar working conditions and interterritorial wage relationships made parity impractical. After a postponement from April 10th to May 1st, the strike finally began with 2,000 stevedores walking off their jobs. It was the first strike at the port of Honolulu since 1918. Only 3 days after the strike began, the communist issue was raised by the Honolulu Advertiser when that newspaper began a scurrilous, unsigned series which came to be known as the Dear Joe letters. Some excerpts from the first letter will give the reader an idea of the effect the Advertiser was trying to create with these bogus letters from a longshoreman to Joe Stalin. What are your next orders, Joe? Strike the ships. 2,000 men can and have tied up a community of 450,000 people. Every man who strikes is tying up the hopes, prospects, job security, and welfare of 220 people. Good stuff. Give those strikers what they want. Then let those strikers kid every other worker, sugar, pineapple, office workers, clerks, saying, you're suckers. Look at our union, we got ours. We should worry, you poor sap. Let's have a sugar strike. A few plantations made money last year, others have some hopes of making some, so let's strike 'em. Why should any plantations make money? It ought to be ours. Worry about the stockholders. Nuts, even if they are widows and orphans. The hell with them. Come on, Joe Stalin. We've got Hawaii all set up for you. It's a pushover. Easy. We've brought business to a standstill, busted a lot of people, even some war heroes. We've caused untold hardship. Right down the alley. What are your next orders, Joe? We're ready. Your dope sure works. 5. This, it must be remembered, was written when the 178-day Longshore strike was only in its third day. The Honolulu Record reacted quickly to the Dear Joe letter. In his front page, 4-column editorial Wednesday, entitled, What are your next orders, Joe? Thurston implies that longshoremen are brutal, callous to the needs of others, and agents of Moscow. In contrast, he identifies Big Five stockholders only as widows and orphans, and inconvenienced businessmen only as war heroes. But the people of Hawaii have learned much since 1920, even if Thurston and the Advertiser still pipe the same tune. Footnote, Honolulu Record, May 5, 1949, page 1. The Honolulu Record was a radical, labor-oriented weekly. The first issue was published on July 1, 1948, and was used as a sample for the purpose of raising capital and subscribers. Regular weekly publication began on August 8, 1948, just 5 days after the beginning of the Reineki hearing, as coincidence would have it. The paper was the object of anti-communist attacks during its entire 10-year history. Even the House Committee on Un-American Activities wrote a report on it. The Record died of exhaustion on July 3, 1958, less than 6 months after the reversal of the conviction of the so-called Hawaii 7 for violation of the Smith Act. 2 of the Hawaii 7 were principals in the management and operation of the Record: Koji Ariyoshi, the editor, and Danishi Jack Komodo, circulation manager, and general factotum. Footnote end. The Dear Joe letters continued throughout the strike, with regular, and generally anonymous letters of agreement appearing on the editorial pages in their support. There was a bit of confusion due to the fact that the Advertiser had so regularly attacked congressional delegate and rival publisher, Joe Farrington, and on at least 2 occasions, the Advertiser felt it necessary to point out that the Dear Joe of the letters was Stalin, not Farrington. By mid-May, the strike was commonly referred to by anti-ILWU forces as a blockade. Dwight C. Steele, president of the Hawaii Employers Council, described it as a strike against the territory rather than the stevedoring firms. By the end of May, the conspiracy theory of the strike was full-blown. Hawaii's crisis today is San Francisco's and the Pacific Coast's problem, and in a large sense, it is the nation's problem. In a word, it is the crucial issue of how much longer this nation is going to allow its economic heritage and prosperity to be sabotaged deliberately by a small group of greedy, ruthless Moscow party line leaders. Taken by itself, the present longshore wage differences might well be resolved were it not for the fact that the union demands are a part of the greater ruined Hawaii strategy. The Honolulu Star-Bulletin refrained from excessive rhetoric in its editorial comment on the strike. That paper's chief concern was over the pragmatic value of the ILWU's tactics. If it is ILWU's strategy that the waterfront employers are to be brought to terms by imposing food shortages on the people of Hawaii, then it is a strategy which the rank and file should repudiate. Such tactics can't in the long run win the battle for recognition and respect, which are avowed goals of unionism over the nation. The Star-Bulletin's chief preoccupation with communism was related to that paper's concern over statehood. The Star-Bulletin was convinced that the Advertiser's constant hammering away at the communist menace was hurting Hawaii's chances for statehood. The editors called for outside investigations of Hawaii and the strike, which would, they contended, demonstrate that Hawaii was not the center of a communist plot. Housewives joined in the protest against the strike, forming anti-strike clubs, writing letters to the editor, initiating the Cables to Truman program, and organizing the Broom Brigade to picket the ILWU headquarters at Pier 11. Although encouraged by the advertiser and anti-communist groups, the women had little impact upon the course of the strike. The union members did enjoy watching the Broom Brigade and chuckled when some of the women paraded in front of the ILWU headquarters chanting, "Where are your leaders? Where's Art Rutledge?" Footnote, Honolulu Record, June 2, 1949, page 4. Part of the ladies' confusion was undoubtedly related to the tendency of many to think of all labor leaders in the same light. Certainly, Art Rutledge had been a strong foe of the ILWU and had been very critical of the Union for its failure to rid itself of its communist leadership. However, many may have remembered that the organization the women came into existence in 1946 as a coalition of women's clubs to protest a general strike among all public utilities workers, and that Art Rutledge was the initial object of their enmity. The president of the Honolulu Blood Bank said she went to Rutledge after the general strike was announced and told him that an electrical stoppage would result in the shutdown of the refrigeration system which protected Honolulu's supply of whole blood. She reported that Rutledge's reply was that the Union is sorry if a few people have to die during the stoppage, but it is necessary for the welfare of the people. In the face of the great public outcry which followed, the AFL's Central Labor Council called off the general strike. The women quickly turned to other matters, the most noteworthy of which was a vigorous brand of anti-communism. When Art Rutledge ran for the Territorial House of Representatives in 1948, he found himself whipped both ways by the communist issue. He was assumed to be pro-communist by some because he was a labor leader. Others were offended because they felt he had used the communist issue divisively in both the labor movement and the Democratic Party. In the Democratic primary in the 5th District on Oahu in 1948, Rutledge found himself without any significant voting base and finished 10th out of 11 candidates. He trailed the leader, Charles Kahane, by a 5-to-1 margin. Footnote end. Governor Steinbach lobbied for legislation to prevent dock shutdowns during labor disputes. Delegate Farrington submitted several bills to Congress, and many officials called upon President Truman to take action under the Taft-Hartley Act. But it was the Bar Association of Hawaii which first asked the federal government to determine whether the strike was communist-inspired. The Bar Association sent a resolution to Emanuel Seller, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, who turned it over to the House Committee on Un-American Activities, commonly known as HUAC. John S. Wood, chairman of HUAC, announced that he would investigate and make a preliminary report to the committee. All told, 6 separate agencies of the federal government made at least a preliminary investigation of the strike. In Hawaii, several community groups were formed to press for investigation of the strike as a communist plot and to draw national attention to the communist menace in the territory. The most vocal of these, the Hawaii Residents Association, IMUA, was formed on June 14, 1949, to call attention to the creeping paralysis of communism in Hawaii. On June 25, 1949, the Conference of Civic Organizations met for the first time to combat attacks of communist agents against civic organizations. One of the most heavy-handed appeals for help was a 2-page advertisement placed in the New York Times on June 23, 1949, and in the Washington Post on June 24, 1949. After identifying the men crucifying Hawaii as people on HUAC's list of known communists, the statement concluded, "We know that the people of the 48 states do not know what the people of Hawaii are up against, and we can't seem to find anyone in America that gives a damn." According to the advertisement itself, the message had been paid for by the voluntary subscriptions of thousands of people of Hawaii. According to Charles P. Laro, author of the 1972 biography Harry Bridges, the ad had been placed directly by advertiser-publisher Lauren Thurston. This writer has found no evidence to support the contention that thousands of people had paid for the advertisement. The most publicized demand for a probe into the purpose of the strike came from U.S. Senator Hugh Butler, Republican from Nebraska, the bitter foe of Hawaiian statehood. The so-called Butler Report, properly titled Statehood for Hawaii, Communist Penetration of the Hawaiian Islands, was released at the height of the dock strike in June 1949. Butler announced in this report, which he claimed to have researched in the fall of 1948, that communism had a firm grip on the economic, social, and political life of the islands, that Harry Bridges was the unseen communist dictator of the territory of Hawaii, that the ILWU was responsible for directing the spread of communism in accordance with Moscow's orders, and that Moscow regarded Hawaii as one of its principal operating bases in the campaign for a communist United States of America. Butler gave as his source official communist documents now in the hands of the Department of Justice in Washington. He continued in his identification of the documents in question. On February 24, 1948, Lieutenant Governor Arthur W. Coolidge of Massachusetts said, in a public address before the American veterans of World War II, "At Quincy, Massachusetts, I charge that communism's key assault on the United States is starting in Hawaii." I accuse Moscow's secret agents of launching a new surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. If this attack is successful, it will be fully as harmful to our national security as was the sneak blow delivered by Japanese bombs. Lieutenant Governor Coolidge based his charges on a set of secret instructions issued by the Communist Party to its agents in Hawaii. These documents outlined a four-pronged communist offensive in Hawaii, aimed simultaneously to undermine all religion, to penetrate and capture all labor unions, to discredit and undermine the free press, and to infiltrate all education. These documents were seized in the Hawaiian Islands by federal authorities. They have become the basis of a determined further investigation of communist penetration in the islands. What Must We Do was once again dredged up. Butler was using John Rienecki's 1935 document, which had been cited by Lieutenant Governor Coolidge, who had obtained it from Governor Steinbach, who had received it from John K. Akow, Jr., who had secured it from John Rienecki before there was a Communist Party in Hawaii. As feeble as this sounds, it got worse. The Butler Report was soon cited by many as authoritative on communism in Hawaii. The Honolulu Star-Bulletin was thoroughly disgusted with Butler's accusations and with his timing, as he selected the period of the waterfront strike in Hawaii to emphasize his theory that the strike is directly due to communist influence, and that Hawaii is in the political as well as economic grip of commies taking their orders from Moscow. The Advertiser, by way of contrast, was ecstatic about Butler's admonitions and recommendations, especially the senator's suggestion that the Smith Act might provide a good way to get rid of Harry Bridges and other subversive ILWU leaders. The emergence of the Butler Report gave a big boost to those who saw the dock strike as part of a communist conspiracy. Edward Gibbons, publisher of the mainland anti-communist news service Alert, was invited to address a gathering of prominent Republicans in Honolulu. Gibbons got some of the communist watchers to take their eyes off of the Soviet Union with this statement: Harry Bridges and his boys are forced to put their future in American labor on the block to help the cause of the Chinese communists. A New York magazine called Plain Talk printed a horror story about communism and Hawaii's dock strike with the title, How to Capture an Island. Fifth Column Attacks Hawaii. The author, Steve Woods, described how on May Day, 1949, the International Working Class Day in Moscow, the Communists launched their offensive to capture this strategic island group. Woods invited any doubters to consult with Akiro Izuka. Perhaps the most elaborate version of the conspiracy theory was the one developed in the Scripps Howard newspapers by Edwin C. Heinck, assistant managing editor of the Indianapolis Times. Heinck wrote a four-part series describing Moscow's operation in Hawaii. The series was carried in newspapers throughout the United States. The Honolulu Advertiser printed it in full. The series turned out to be almost entirely drawn out of the Butler Report, What Must We Do, and the Izuka pamphlet, all the well-worn friends of the anti-communists. But for 4 days in August 1949, the series was offered up as new evidence of what the Advertiser had long been telling its readers. It was inevitable that the president of the ILWU, Harry R. Bridges, would become an issue in the 1949 dock strike in Hawaii. The CIO was in the midst of the last stages of its struggle with communism, which had been going on in earnest since the time of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. In March 1948, CIO President Philip Murray had ousted Bridges from his post as CIO Regional Director for Northern California because of Bridges' support of Henry Wallace and his opposition to the Marshall Plan. By the end of 1950, 11 CIO unions, including the ILWU, were tried and found by the CIO's Executive Council to be guilty of being dominated by the Communist Party. All 11 unions were expelled from the CIO. Only the year before, Harry Bridges had led a successful 95-day longshore strike on the West Coast. Enmity had grown in government circles, as well as in the CIA, and shortly after the beginning of Hawaii's dock strike, Bridges was indicted along with two of his chief ILWU lieutenants, Bob Robertson and Henry Schmidt, for perjury and conspiracy to commit perjury at the time the much-harassed labor leader was granted citizenship in 1945. Bridges was charged with having lied to the judge who admitted him to citizenship when he denied being a communist. Robertson and Schmidt were charged with having conspired with Bridges in the alleged perjury. Footnote: Bridges struggled with the perjury case for more than 4 years from the time of his original indictment in 1949. His conviction, which came in 1950, was finally overturned by the United States Supreme Court by a 4-3 vote on June 15, 1953. For an interesting short account of this struggle, see Laro, pp. 299-338. Footnote end. Bridges' election in August 1949 as president of the International Union of Seamen and Dockers, a subsidiary of the World Federation of Trade Unions, which was known as a communist line organization, and his many party line statements led to the popular conviction that in solving the problem of Hawaii's dock strike, the problem of Harry Bridges also had to be solved. Within the ranks of the ILWU, there was an abortive effort to oust Bridges. Joseph Maldonado, a member of San Francisco ILWU Local 10, organized a group which called itself the Maritime Democratic Committee. The group allegedly authorized Maldonado to go to his native Hawaii to set up a chapter there. Upon his arrival, Maldonado explained to the press that he had come because the strike must be concluded, because its leading elements are not working for the interests of the workers of the community, but to further the cause of socialism in the islands. Maldonado quickly became the toast of anti-communist civic groups, spoke at meetings, picketed with the Broom Brigade at Pier 11, and made anti-Bridges statements on cue. Although he claimed to speak for 2,200 men in ILWU Local 10, Maldonado was repudiated by that local and expelled from the union. According to the Honolulu Record, W. Tip Davis, second vice president of IMUA, admitted having brought Maldonado to Hawaii to bottle up subversive elements on the territory's waterfront. The nearest the federal government came to direct involvement in the 1949 Longshore strike in Hawaii was a Senate Committee on Labor and Public Welfare hearing on a bill introduced by U.S. Senator William Nolan, Republican from California. The Nolan bill would have given the president authority to appoint boards of inquiry having the power to make binding recommendations with respect to labor disputes between the continental United States and the territory of Hawaii. U.S. Senator Hubert Humphrey, Democrat from Minnesota, summed up the thinking of many senators at the hearing when he said that the whole episode sounded more like a power struggle between labor and management than the groundwork for a communist takeover. The Advertiser vented its frustration over the inaction of the United States Senate by printing a full-page editorial on the front page of its July 15, 1949 issue under the headline, "So It's Up to Us, eh?" The editorial took the President and Congress to task for treating the people of the territory of Hawaii as second-class citizens and then offered a long list of recommendations for local action, including loyalty oaths for Union members. The editorial concluded, "These are American rights we are going to see at long last, given as much, and a damn sight more consideration than the wishy-washy laws that every commie now uses to hide behind and bring apparently legal pestilence, suffering, and want to Hawaii." By mid-July, the territorial government, reacting to growing economic problems, decided it was time to act. Governor Steinbach appointed a fact-finding board, but when the ILWU insisted that the board's recommendations be made binding, the employers raised the cry of arbitration and refused to be so committed. The board went about its business, and when its report was submitted, the employers readily accepted its recommendation for a 14-cent wage increase. Now it was the union's turn to demur. After the fact-finding board was constituted, its members were asked by none other than Harry Bridges to look into the question of whether the strike was a part of a communist conspiracy or not. The employers' negotiating team stipulated that communism was not an issue, and the board indicated that they thought it improper for them to investigate. The fact-finding board ended its work with little to show for its efforts. The second effort on the part of the territory to solve the dock strike was more successful. A special session of the territorial legislature was convened on July 26, 1949, at the request of Governor Steinbach, who asked for and was granted power to seize and operate the docks in the name of the territory of Hawaii. On August 10, 1949, with the strike more than 100 days old, the governor seized the docks. Footnote: at this point, support for the ILWU came from an interesting source. Art Rutledge, known to be hostile to any taint of communism and a frequent critic of Harry Bridges, marched on the picket line at the ILWU president's side to protest the Dock Seizure Act. Rutledge was quoted as saying, "The CIO and AFL may be miles apart in political thinking, but as trade unionists we agree that the legislature has enacted a strike-breaking measure which will do away with unions." Footnote end. By October, the flow of commerce was almost normal. Finally, on October 4, 1949, the dock strike was settled for a wage increase of 14 cents, 8 cents of which was to be retroactive to March 1, 1949. There was also an additional 7-cent increase which would begin on March 1, 1950. The question of who won and who lost in the 1949 dock strike is a very complicated one and is essentially extraneous to the issues with which we are dealing here. Perhaps the most significant aftermath of the 1949 dock strike was expressed in a comment made to the author by A. Smicer in a 1975 interview. Both sides, said Smicer, who was then a political writer for the Honolulu Star-Bulletin, knew they never wanted to go through another experience like that again. Footnote: interview with A.A. Smicer, March 21, 1975. In interviews with David Thompson, educational director of the ILWU, and Robert McElrath, regional director of the ILWU, on March 13 and March 21, 1975, respectively. It is interesting to note that in lengthy conversations which involved a good deal of give and take, there was one point on which the two ILWU leaders were in complete and unequivocal agreement. The 1949 dock strike had been an unqualified ILWU victory. Footnote end. One factor of great significance which emerges from a study of the 1949 dock strike is the absence of anti-communist harassment of ILWU officials by the federal government during the strike. According to James Larrow, a Bridges biographer, the man who played the crucial role in staving off federal intervention was John A. Burns, whom the ILWU had supported in the 1948 delegates race. In an interview with Larrow, Burns explained how Jack Hall, supported by a rising young Democrat named Daniel Inouye, came to him for help. They asked that I do whatever I could to keep the government from using Taft-Hartley, since they feared that President Truman might yield to the overwhelming pressure being put on him. According to Larrow, Burns made the rounds in Washington, D.C., convincing Morris Taubman, Secretary of Labor, not to invoke Taft-Hartley, Frank Tavener, General Counsel for the House Committee on Un-American Activities, to delay hearings in Hawaii until the strike was ended, and Alex Campbell of the Justice Department to resist pressures to call for an early trial for Harry Bridges on charges that the ILWU leader had committed perjury and fraud in obtaining his citizenship in 1945. Having diffused the issue of communism to a degree, Burns then got together with Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service Director, Cy Ching. They worked out an agreement to move the negotiations from Honolulu to New York City, where the strike was finally settled. Footnote: in the author's March 21, 1975 interview with Robert McElrath, the ILWU's regional director, confirmed the fact that Burns had played a very important role in bringing the 1949 dock strike to a successful conclusion, a fact which certainly helps to explain the continuing support the ILWU gave Burns throughout his subsequent political career. Footnote end. Although the question of communism had been subordinated to substantive bargaining points during the closing days of the Longshore strike, it had been an ever-present issue throughout the long ordeal. With settlement reached, anti-communism was quick to find new channels of expression.